researcher, genealogist, writer, reenactor, and tour guide living in historic St. Genevieve, Missouri. He is a member of the Milice de St. Genevieve, l'Ami, Center for French Colonial Studies, Missouri Preservation, and the Sons of the Union Veterans of the Civil War. He has been trustee of the State Historical Society of Missouri since 2006 and has served on the executive committee since 2009. He is past president of the Foundation for Restoration of St. Genevieve, coordinates the Foundation's annual history conference, and is a member of the Foundation's Speakers Bureau. Bob has appeared in the movie New Offenburg, on the television program Who Do You Think You Are with Melissa Etheridge, and authored a chapter in the book The American Revolutionary War in the West. He most recently published an article, Give Us This Day, Our Daily Bread, in Le Journal, published by the Center for French Colonial Studies. Please give a warm welcome to our final speaker, Bob Mueller, who will present Jacques Guibourd and his family.
I don't have a children to start off with. Jacques Jean René Guibourd de Luzenet. When I tour grade school kids, I always tell them, how do you like to have to sign your name that way on a test every day? He was obviously a royalist of the upper class of France. He's one of the true Frenchmen that we had here come to St. Louis. Most of our French people were from either French Canada or were sons or daughters of French Canadians. But so I'm going to talk a little bit about who he was, his family, his life here in St. Genevieve, and his home. And that's where I was kind of introduced to Jacques. I'm an engineer by trade, and when I came back to St. Genevieve, retired from Florida, I don't know why did we come back from Florida? She doesn't know. But I was interested in the architecture, obviously, and so I started joining the foundation, and I took the tours of the Guibourd house, and was amazed at the Norman trusses. And we just talked about the house and the wonderful Louis XV and Louis XVI furniture that's in there. We weren't really talking about Jacques. And my background in history is that of a genealogist. And when you start in genealogy, you start finding out about people. And those are the stories that bring these houses like the Guibourd house and the Old Oak house to life. And so I started trying to study who this Jacques Guibourd was and where he came from. So he starts out, he's born in France in a little town called Condé, which is in the Loire Valley. You can see the little star down there, pretty close to the ocean, southwest of Paris. And it's really between the towns of Nantes and Angers. And we have other famous people from Nantes, Ferdinand Roger, and John James Audubon who came here. So there was kind of a connection. Those guys came later, but they kind of interact with the Roger family does with the Guibourd family later on. But he was educated there. We don't know a lot about his early years, but he ends up down in Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti. And actually there's in the island there's actually two countries. The westernmost part was called Saint-Domingue, and it was controlled by the French. And the one on the right was controlled by Spain and is now was Santo Domingo at the time. And so we don't know exactly where he was living down in Saint-Domingue, but the legend is that he was a secretary to a plantation owner there. He was very well educated. And you know, the islands were very important to the French because of the sugar cane and the slave trade and all of that brought goods and money. And eventually the Africans that were there made up a great majority of the population. And in 1791 there was an uprising, and it turned out to be the first successful slave uprising that had occurred. The whites were in a minority. There was a number of, and they had kind of split into two factions. By this time, the French Revolution had occurred, so some of them were royalists, some were for the revolutionary factions. Then we had a large group of, I think they were called jeunes de couleur, free blacks, and they were campaigning for civil rights. And about that time, the slaves of northern Saint-Domingue organized a massive rebellion, which began on August 22nd, 1791. What happened then was that the slaves started killing the free blacks and the French, and this is one old picture of that. But what's kind of important to our story is that they finally got into the cities, and the legend that we tell about Jacques Guibourd was that his slave Moros put him in a barrel, put the lid on, and rolled him up a gangplank to go back to France and escape this revolution that was going on. The fighting destroyed much of the capital, and they sent the French natives, or the French Navy deposited the refugees in Norfolk, Virginia. Many of them settled in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York. Around 1800, about 20% of the population of Philadelphia was emigres from the slave uprising revolution. So you can see a little bit more. Well, this is the next one. So they go back to France, according to the legend. And the revolution was kind of over, except in the Loire Valley. And a little bit south of there, there was something called the War of the Vendée. And until I started reaching, I didn't know about this. If you recall, during the French Revolution, the revolutionists decided to take close down the churches and that sort of thing, and destroy the statues and stuff. Well, these people in the Loire Valley and below wanted to remain Catholic and remain using the religion that they were brought up on. So a number of battles ensued, and it's called the War of the Vendée, and this is around 1792. So if Jacques Guibourd goes back to France, he's got problems with a name like Guibourd de Lucenay, I mean, being a royalist. So he comes and he leaves France, again with his slave Moors, according to the legend, and they come to the United States. Now, we got a couple of different stories. This is his son Omer's diary that's up in the Missouri History Museum. This was written, I think, around 1827, where after Omer had went to France. But he talks about his father having left the slave revolt, and he set off aboard a ship which was provided to him in his native land, which we found ablaze with a revolutionary conflagration. Shortly after he had been welcomed back to his family, he found himself faced with the cruel dilemma of either taking up arms against his native country or leaving the country. He decides to come to the United States. And I think it says in here that when he got here, sad, ill, and without resources, he arrived in this fair land of liberty. Cradle of my infancy, unknown, knowing no one, making, together with one of his companions in misfortune, the most slender of resources which were left to him after the shipwreck. We don't know what the shipwreck is. So this is his son writing about his father. As I will show you later, I don't think he was very destitute at the time. We did find him in Philadelphia in 1798. This is a certificate of residence by the French consul there, and he describes Jacques in this document as 5'4" tall. The French weren't very tall people. He had black hair and eyebrows, an aquitaine nose, and I haven't really figured that out yet. There's an aquiline nose, which is like horse-like nose, but I'm not sure what aquitaine is. He had an average mouth, average chin, oval face. It indicates he is from Conde and Saint-Domingue, so it kind of verifies that story. So he comes here to St. Genevieve in 1799, and part of the legend is that he came here before 1799 and went back to France, or back to East, and then came back again. Really haven't seen any documents where he's here in 1798, but definitely in 1799. So there is a document that people use to say this is when he got the property, which is located at 4th and Merchant Street. He owned the whole block there. And in this document, he's writing. I mean, he's the one that's describing it. He says, Jacques Guibourd, a former resident of Saint-Domingue, was obliged to go looking for refuge in the United States, where he spent some time, and having heard about the favorable advantages that the Spanish government was providing, and the desire to live under a government similar to that under which they had been raised, determined to travel to Upper Louisiana, where he arrived with a passport from the minister of Spain. He wanted to return to America in order to look for the means by selling some properties, and the following year, after completing these projects, he returned to St. Genevieve, the place where he was chosen to reside. So that's, again, kind of saying that, yeah, he might have been here before, but we can't prove that. This document's up in the Missouri History Museum. So he gets here in 1799, and we mentioned earlier some marriage documents. This happens to be the marriage document from the church, and he's marrying a girl named Ursula Verbeau. And this is on January 24th in 1800. He just got here in 1799, probably about mid-year. It says he was a native of the parish of Saint-Denis in Conde, Diocese of Angers, and his parents were Christophe Ambroise Guibourd and Jean Gibault. Ursula's parents were Jean-Baptiste Barbeau's père and his wife Jean Lerosse, both natives of Prairie du Rocher. What's interesting to me is in studying records in St. Genevieve, I've really become, I told Sharon earlier, enamored with the signatures of people. They're just, I mean, this is again like the one on Andrew Henry. This is the who's who of St. Genevieve of the time. So there's also a civil marriage contract in our records. And this is what we talked about this morning, where it would say what the spouse would get and the other spouse would get, if there's any principal, what was the other term that they would get? Communicati.
Doer.
Yeah. And so we do have that civil contract. Here they spell her name, B-A-R-B-O-T, like good old Jerome. They kind of spell things as they wish. And again, there were just a myriad of signatures on here. One of the things I've been studying lately is this little 2 slashes with the 3 dots. Between Carl Eckberg and Sharon and I, we're trying to, what do those really mean? Because we see them in a number of other documents, and there are several of them, I think, on this one too. Sometimes they put the 3 dots under their name in the graph. So who was this Ursula Verbeau? One of the nice things that we have is a painting of the Barbeau grounds, which is over near Prairie du Rocher. If you're going from Modoc, you're driving up to the Prairie du Rocher, you finally come to like a big bluff on the right, and there was a creek there. Now it's just a little bit of ditch. But that was the Barbeau house, and this was drawn actually later. But what's interesting to me, and I think it would be a whole lecture all by itself, is the Barbeau family. Jean-Baptiste Barbeau père was a captain of the militia. He was different things in Prairie du Rocher. Was well known even during the British occupation. And he had a son, Jean-Baptiste Jr., who marries Catherine Lejeune. And then he has five 5 girls. And what's interesting, there'd be a whole lecture on the 5 girls of the Bordeaux. Marie-Jean marries Jean-Baptiste Valet. That was important. Marie-Rienne Julie marries Jean-Baptiste Johnny, who lives about just down the road from the Beauvais Amarillo house. Suzanne marries Pierre Lecomte of Cahokia. And they have 2 sons, Eloy and Hilaire Lecomte, which come back to St. Genevieve. Marie-Louise marries Nicolas Giraud of Cahokia. And he was one of the more powerful people in his mansion is still standing in Cahokia, Brooklyn. And Constance marries Andre Roy of Prairie du Rocher. Well, the kicker on the last one was that Constance Pelagie Roy, the daughter of Andre and Constance, becomes the wife of Ferdinand Rocher, who is Audubon's business partner. So there's again a connection here. I think Carl Lynn's book, Colonial St. Genevieve, has this neat diagram about how the families of St. Genevieve, the wealthy ones, kind of intermarried and kept the power structure and that sort of thing. And this is obviously kind of what happened here. Jacques and his wife, Ursule, have 5 children. The first is Eugene Jacques Pierre, born in 1801. Second one was, we don't know exactly what his or her name was. All we know is that this infant was buried on November 21st, 1803 in the Memorial Cemetery. Jean Edouard was born on January 9th, 1805 and buried the next year in June 1806. So childhood mortality was fairly common. I mean, here on the rivers of the frontier, and you can see they're having children pretty frequently, and that probably added to the burden. So one of the children, Omer Francois, was born October 23, 1807, and he's the one that had that diary that we talked about. And the last one was Jules Joseph Marie, born November 8, 1811. So there's 3 boys, and all baptized in St. Genevieve and are recorded in the Church of St. Genevieve records. But one of the things we know that in 1799, Jacques Guibourd had a store here. And I still remember the day I was up at the Missouri History Museum Research Center on Skinker with a friend of mine. And we had asked for the Louis Guibourd file. And in it is a stack of papers about that thick. And it's the business journal of Jacques Guibourd in 1799 and 1801. And that place you can whisper and hear it across the room. I think they could hear us across Forest Park. It's one of those eureka moments. This document is marvelous. It says who Jacques sold to, what he sold them, how much he sold them for, and if you go to the second page, it says how he gets paid. And we had pictures of coins up there earlier. Very little money is exchanged hands. There's some Guibourdi, which are, I think, an island species, but a lot of it is salt, hides, even ferry boat rides. He's doing business across the river. We recently had Michael Rupp give us a presentation on fiddling at our Christmas or spring gathering. So I went back and I looked at found the 8 or 9 guys that he's selling violin strings to in 1800. So we kind of know who the fiddlers were. And there was a few, as Andrew Henry's wife was fiddling around.
But you didn't have any jokes.
I just thought that one out. Maybe that's But this gives you an insight into what people are buying in St. Genevieve. There's shoes in there, there's hats, there's a lot of cloth, a lot of threads. Very, very interesting stuff. So here it is, Jacques Guibourd becomes a tannery owner. Remember, he's destitute, he's been shipwrecked, his son says he doesn't have any money. Well, in December of 1799, he purchases this tract of land down on River Vause that has a tankard from Pascal Detchmendy. September 1800, he leases part of this to Jean Paul, the resident of the Saline, for a period ending in November 1, 1803. When I was reading the document about this, it was kind of interesting, the terms of the lease. It wasn't money that exchanged hands. There were about 10 different clauses. Paul was to get 1/3 of the new barn horn cattle and pigs that are there. Guibourd gave Paul 1 pair of oxen, a yoke with its straps, a cart, an English plow with its chains, 12 cows, 6 pigs, and a boar. Paul was required to clear and append to the existing 10 arpents enclosed another 10, but he can use 1,200 perches, which are poles, that the Guibourd abandons to him. The new barn pigs and horn cattle were to be counted and divided each November 1st, 2/3 to Guibourd, 1/3 to Paul. Paul could not use that pair of oxen for somebody else's, or go to somebody else's land and use them or hire them out. Paul was to replace any animal that dies, except because of his negligence, and give hay to nurture them during the winter. 3 months' notice is required to end the lease, and so there was no money exchanged hands. They were going to get some of the pigs and cows out of this thing. In 1804, Guibourd leases this tankard to John Myers. By this time, both Guibourd and J.B. Valley are owners, and in the agreement, Myers was to tan and curry all skins Guibourd and Valley would furnish to him. The partners would get 2/3 and Myers 1/3. And if another inhabitant brought Myers skins to be tanned, the partners would get 1/4 of them. Partners were to provide all tallow, oil, and blocking necessary over the next 2 years. And they were also to get 100 sides of skins tanned or curried, of which party would be from the upper leather and could not be from cows more than 2 years old. So they were looking for the cream of the crop. By this time, there were several other tanyards in St. Genevieve that Jedediah Kendall, 1791, and Thomas Donahue, 1799 on the Saline, and Francis Poirier, 1793 on the establishment. So tanning the skins, I think we heard earlier that a lot of, in the earlier times, the Osage women would tan those hides that the Native American men would capture or kill, and now we are actually having tanyards. So also, Jacques Guibourd ends up with a lead mine. Most of the upper crust of St. Genevieve had lead mines, either at Mine Lamont, Big River, or over in what is now Old Mines. Just this particular mine, and I'm not sure exactly, there's 2 things. One's called the Guibourd Diggings, and I think you heard about new diggings earlier as an area. The other one is called Mine of Guibourd. But we do know that a guy named Jean-Baptiste Mueller in 1792 had a grant for an area over by Old Mines, and he abandoned it, and it was re-granted to Jacques Guibourd in 1799. This destitute guy, he's getting another lead mine. On May 25th, 1803, 31 miners, including Jacques Guibourd, sent a concession request to Francois Valley, who was commandant and captain of the militia, indicating that they had been cultivating and improving land at Old Mines for a number of years, but they didn't have title. And so they had just heard on May 18th, 1803, that pretty soon they were not going to be Spanish anymore or French anymore. So they were kind of worried about their titles. And after the Americans came, titles and trial by jury were the 2 big concerns of the French who were here. Were those titles going to be on? So they're asking, hey, we want paper. So on June 4th, 1803, Charles de Halt Delassus de Lousière, the lieutenant governor up in St. Louis, ruled that a tract of 12,400 arpents be surveyed, and 31 applicants be granted 400 arpents each. And there would be a drawing by lot to determine who got which one. Well, and it was it started oldest to the newest owner, or claimed to be owner over there. And Jacques Guibourd got one, which is right here in yellow. And that old mines concession is very important. Unfortunately, people that had lived on the land, had a house on the land, didn't necessarily get the plot where their house was. So that caused a lot of confusion in old mines. It was surveyed by Andrew Soulard in February 1806. In 1855, Missouri Geological Surveys indicated at Guibourd there were no deep shafts. Remember somebody mentioned earlier that there were just small pits that they would dig to find the lead. Though I think Moses Austin had started having some deep shafts. So again, now here's this destitute guy and he's getting more land. He gets land in the big field. So these are the long, narrow, usually 1, 2, or 3 arpit wide pieces of land that go from the fence, or I guess here it was the South Gabbery to the river. Further down, that would be much longer. And they were these long, it's called the long lots. And his is right here. And so there's other people that have it: Joseph Pratt, Charles Valet, Louis LaRose, Part 84. So again, these are kind of important people in St. Geneviève's history. So he's granted this concession there. He, in 1804, he buys 150 arpits of land from Patrick Fleming. We heard that name earlier today. North of town, and another 150 from Joseph Girard. So he's getting pretty well settled. He's got a wife. He's starting to have kids by 1804. He also becomes a politician. He served as a commissioner of rates and levies. He was one of the original trustees of his Louisiana Academy, and it was the first school of higher education west of the Mississippi, and was chartered by the legislature in 1808, and that building is still here. Included guys like John Baptiste Valet, Jacques Maxwell Priest, Francois de Jany, Joseph Pratt, Walter Fenwick, Andrew Henry, as we heard earlier, and Arian Elliott, Nathaniel Pope, just Henry Dodge and Henry Beale. So he is in the power structure of St. Genevieve. Unfortunately, Jacques dies in 1812. We know that he was buried on May 29th. Sometimes in the church records, which you can see below, they would indicate that the person died the day before or 2 days before. Not in this record. We only know that he was buried on a given day. And he is supposedly buried in one of our above ground crypts. Probably one of our taller ones. Usually they're just box crypts that are only about this high. But he sits up on the hill near Senator Lynn's, and it's a pretty majestic monument. Unfortunately, they don't bury people above ground. These people were buried below ground. But and unfortunately, it's made of sandstone, and we've lost a lot of the inscription. We had one from about 1985 when Ron Beckerman did it. You can't even see those anymore. So in the custom of the French, when somebody died, one of the great things that we had is they would send 2 or 3 people in to do an estate inventory. And it is one of the great, like that business journal, they got into detail. They would count the number of forks and knives and plates and all kinds of equipment in the yard, and animals and slaves, and it's just a marvelous piece of work. I love the French. They do, when they do a deed, it's They don't say the meets and bounds, they say this is a lot, and this is the size, and this is the house, and this is how it's roofed, and it may be floored above and below. There's a corn crib of a certain size, also got a shingle roof. I mean, it's just really good stuff, and these estate inventories are the things that let us tell the story of people that didn't keep diaries, didn't keep records other than this. So here's the order that Rasul Guibourd was given, or Guibourd was given when Jacques died. It says that Jean-Baptiste Valet and her and somebody else were supposed to do this inventory. Unfortunately, we can't find the inventory. It wasn't in the records, because that would tell us what was in that house when he died in 1812. I keep looking. Maybe one of these days I will get a link. So then we have Rasul. She's got 3 boys living, and she stays living in the house, and she does not remarry. And I thought that was kind of unusual. Here's a woman that's got quite a bit of money, and she's got young kids, and she doesn't get remarried. Well, I think it's the fact that she had a lot of money, and she was a pretty forceful woman, and she had good relatives, and so she just never did. But she dies in 1843. Says she was 72 years old, and like Jacques, it doesn't specify the date of death. I think you might recall that I mentioned that he had a black enslaved person who put him in the barrel, but his name was Moros, and supposedly he went back to France with him, and then he came to America, and he came to live in St. Genevieve with the Guibourds, and he dies in June 28, 1844. Anybody know what happened in 1844? What was that?
Flood?
A flood.
Yeah.
So we had the flood of 1785 that supposedly went to the top of the houses in the old town, and the flood of 1844 was 3 foot higher than that. So he supposedly, this is his death certificate, says the undersigned was buried in the cemetery of this parish, the body of the Negro Moros, who accidentally drowned near Widow Ziegler's house. So they do an inquest, because the rumor was that he died violently. But they send the constable down and the assistant constable, and they call a jury together, an inquest jury, and they rule that it is an accidental death, that he died in the waters near Hussein Creek, which flowed out of the hills and into the flood plain. I guess Augustus St. John, we know about him. He became a later kind of a historian. Theophilus DeVore and Theodore Tomier were the jury. It also said that he was a free black when he died, and we've never been able to find those papers where he was free. And there also is a kind of a strange record in the marriage record. He may have gotten married. It's hard to tell because they don't give a lot of names and description of father. With a white person, they would tell who the parents were, where they were from, and we did have 125 marriages in our church of black people, both free and enslaved, but they just don't give those kind of details, so we can't prove that this marriage record is really him. But we do know from various documents that they had a number of enslaved people. But when you look at, you may not be able to read it, but there's a lot of these come from the baptismal records, where it would list what the mother is, and you can see there's only 2 of them that list fathers over on the right of that left-hand list. That's not something that you normally see, because sometimes the fathers were the enslaved person's owner, so they're not going to put that in the record. But I looked at Emily had 4 kids. Lucille had 2, 4, 6, 7. And Therese had 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 kids over her enslaved life with, under the Guibourds. We do see records where her soul would have Dr. Lynn come up and treat one of the enslaved children and that sort of thing. There were a number of other ones. And on the right, we know that there were some other ones, including one of those, it's not on the list, but came from the estate when her soul died. So I mentioned one son, Omer. We do have a picture of him. And I think from that description in 1788, it's probably a fairly good likeness of his father. He wanted to go to France to see his relatives around maybe right after the War of 1812 when his father died. But I think he got all the way to New Orleans and then turned around and came back. But he did go over in 1825 and then wrote the diary when he came home. So after the mother dies, there's 3 boys. Eugene's the oldest. He's living over in Old Mines. I'm going to talk about him later. And Omer and Jules, Joseph, are living with their mother when she dies. And about 6 months after the mother dies, Jules and Omer and their nephew Felix, who is the son of Eugene, take off for France, the home of their ancestors. And Omer and Jules Joseph never come back, even though they had been born in America. Omer marries a woman over there, Sophie Brosset du Perron. And there, I'll show you a family chart. There's a descendant of his named Jacques Guibourd that's still alive. So, Omer is buried in La Colombière in France, in 1875. His wife would die in July the next year. They had 2 children, George and Marie René. And René eventually marries a guy named Henri Marie Joseph de Pontevraud. Unfortunately, we don't know where he's buried. We don't know when he died. Even the modern day descendants living in France don't know where he's at, so that's one of our mysteries. The other son that I mentioned, Eugene Jacques, he's the oldest. He has 13 kids. A lot of them were born in old mines. He was over running the mine on Guibourd over there in the old mines concession. He marries well, Marie St. Jean Beauvais, in 1825. And you can see a lot of his children die in infancy, the first 9. A couple of them get to 16, 18. I think one of them, Omer, actually was on his way to California for the gold rush and died in Westport, Kansas, and then got shipped back to St. Genevieve. 4 of the unmarried children became adults, and we'll talk about them a little bit. Eugene was a member of the first board of common school directors, along with Ichabod Sargent, Francis Rozier, Felix Valley, and Eloy LeComte. He wanted to, we had a plank road that went from Iron Mountain to St. Genevieve for the iron ore. He wanted a spur to go down to Fredericktown. They had also proposed the road was supposed to go to Lions Point, little town south of like near Arcadia, but they found out it wasn't economical. So one to Fredericktown, the other one didn't happen, the third blade. He was a merchant here. He was a postmaster. He was a cashier at St. Genevieve Savings Association owned by Furman Rozier. And he also was a druggist in 1870. So he's the one that we had a chance of having descendants of Jacques Guibourd living in the United States. Unfortunately, none of his adult children married. Felix Guibourd the one that went to France with Homer and Jules Joseph, came back and was a physician. He had studied in Paris and in Angers, and he had returned to St. Genevieve in 1865. And he died in 1885. That's another legend is that he committed suicide in the house. His obituary said he died of dysentery, so I don't know, maybe that is suicide. But, the Post-Dispatch reported he was reserved save to his immediate friends, was an omnivorous reader, had a wonderful tenacious memory, a rare flow of words and conversation, and a surprising fund of general information. Outside of St. Genevieve, his high ability was comparatively unknown because he had not a particular ambition for fame and was supremely indifferent to public opinion. They wrote nice obituaries back then. So we move on to Lewis, and he ends up being the last surviving member of the Guibourd family. He will die in May of 1915. Thankfully, he did contribute a whole bunch of papers to the Missouri History Museum, and some of our earliest deeds are in that file. It's a marvelous file. But he dies in St. Louis, in East St. Louis in May of 1950, but is buried here in town. The next brother, Augusta Guibourd, we know that he ran a hat business here in town, and the hat was when the riverboat would end up at the landing, they would go down there and pick up passengers and bring them back to like the Southern Hotel or one of the other ones. So we see that. But he evidently leaves town, goes to Colorado, because in an Aspen newspaper in 1889, they're looking for him. They said to relieve a brother and sister's anxiety, they thought he was mining in the area and were asking for any information about him. So he's kind of disappeared. He's the one unknown. We don't know if he got married, had any children, or what. And the last was Victorine Guibourd, and she was known as Miss Vicky. She died in the family residence, and a lot of people on the legends is that she's the last resident who lived there, but her obituary said that her brother is living alone, Louis, by himself in the house. So, in essence, here's this Frenchman who marries a daughter of a French Canadian, and they have children, and their whole line dies out in America. So we'll kind of get back to that later. So let's talk about a little bit about his land and his house. This is from the diorama. And, you know, if you look in the, let's see, this is, in the diorama, this is the Guibourd house. You can see the brick kitchen on the back. This is the main house. That is not his first house. If you, his first house is actually right here on this corner where Valley School is. And that whole left, north half of that block belonged to Jacques Guibourd. And he got it from his brother-in-law, Jean-Baptiste Valet, in 1800, probably as a wedding present. And he sells it in 1806 to Joshua Penniman, another name you heard earlier today, for 800 lawful United States dollars. I guess they had some unlawful ones too at the time. But one of the things it says in there, in that, when you get to let's go there. And this is the document where he's selling the property where Valley High School is to Joshua Penniman. And it says a lot, one more apartment or less, where Jacques Guibourd now resides. So in 1806, he's still living, not in the house that we call the Guibourd house, but the one where Joshua Penniman had. It adjoining the property of Joseph Pratt. That was where the Pratt warehouse was, and the convent, and the original grade school. That being the same property which Baptiste Valet and his wife assigned to the Guibourds on February 5th, 1800. So that's how we know kind of that he didn't live on that corner. He didn't get that whole block where his house currently is as property. And there was, we see a concession of land in June of 1799. And people read that, and they said, oh, this is the plot of ground that he's got to build his house eventually. It's not. When you read it, it was a lot that was owned by one Heel in 1792, and Guibourd bought it in 1799 with his destitute dollars. And so that land, and when you hear it described, it's a lot west of the lot of Guibourd. And if you, so this is the Guibourd, and this is Joseph Guibord's, and I think one of them down here was where Guibourd had a lot of land. So that's kind of up where the old school board house was, the White House, kind of in front of the Performing Arts Center. That is what's described in that deed. I'm kind of showing where it is on those maps. So how did he get the house or the lot where his house is at? It was supposedly built in 1806. Recently found some documents where on August 23rd, 1800, Father Jacques Maxwell, Vicar General of the area, and priest of the parish, sold to David de Winay a lot in town 1 arpent wide by 2 arpents deep, bounded on the west, south, and east by streets. To the north, the land sold that day to Jacques Guibourd. He's talking about the lot there where the Guibourd house is now. And evidently, that same day, Jacques had bought the north half of that block. And then on February 22nd, 1801, David de Winay sold the same parcel of land to Jacques Guibourd, and now at this point, Jacques owns that entire block. So we kind of know from dendrochronology, the way we date some of these log houses, where they look at the spacing of the growth rings in the logs, that you can kind of tell with the wet years they're wider, dry years they're narrower. That most of the logs were cut or felled in 1806 or 1807. So we're not sure exactly. I mean, we say 1806, I'm not sure if it's hard to really tell. We know he's moving in 1806, so maybe he did have it built by then. So when her soul died, they ended up splitting up. She, in her will, Eugene and Therese get the 150 arpents of land, or actually 300 that he had owned north of town. You get the north half of the lot in St. Genevieve, which didn't have a house on it. He got several enslaved persons, Peter, Lucille, Emily. We've heard those two, Lucille and Emily, before. Charles, Baptiste, Constance, Tom, and John. So not just female slaves, there were male slaves too, enslaved. The two boys got 4 arpents of land down at the River Vause, south half of the lot that had the house on it. That tract of land in the big field, that tract of land up by the academy, and several enslaved people, Louis called Gumbo, Suki, Therese, Toussaint, Edward, Furman, Francois, Felicite, Emily, and Adelia. So, like I said, about 6 months later, the boys take off for France. So they kind of, in 1859, they gave a power of attorney, and they gave the south half of the house to his brother Eugene. So he's now living in that the south half. This is one of the oldest pictures we have of the house. And as I said, in 1859, Eugene becomes the owner of the south half. In 1880, Felix, the one that was the doctor, becomes the owner after Eugene had died. And in 1885, Felix deeds it to Victorine, and then he dies the next year. But we did have a visitor from France around that same time. It was in the fair play, George Guibourd, who was a nephew of the kids of kids living there, comes to visit them. And I think this is a picture that was them on the porch when they're having a visitor from France. So in 1807 or 1907, Louis sells the house to a Frenchman, Clovis Boyer, and his wife Rosine Sexard, one of the few French-German families we had. There wasn't a lot of intermarriage there. He was a plasterer and actually plastered our church, the 1880 church that we still have now. He sold it for $3,000. He would end up giving it to his son Edgar when he died, and then sold to Jules Valley and his wife Anne Marie in 1931. If you go to the Guibourd house now, you can see that the back porch is a screened-in sun porch. This is what it looked like back when the Sexards, I think that are the Clovis Boyer, that's Mrs. Sexard right there. I don't have a picture of Anne Marie Valley. Jules Valley Sr. was a doctor in St. Louis. Jules Jr. worked for an investment company and had made a lot of money, and he retired. And they bought the house in 1931. He is the great-grandson of Jean Barbeau Valley, John Baptiste. He's not from the Jacques Guibourd line, he's from the John Baptiste line. It's interesting, he still did business in St. Louis, and when he went to St. Louis, he stayed at the Racket Club, John. John just took us up there for a lazy meeting recently. So. He intended it to be a summer home, but it ended up being their only home. Anne Marie was his second wife. He had a daughter by his first wife. Some rumors are that she was a dancer, I'm not sure, but she ends up dying. He dies in 1949, and in 1971 she died. And during the interim between 1949 and 1971, she traveled a lot and bought a lot of Louis XV and Louis XVI furniture. So she did well. When she died, her will said that the house and grounds was to be left to the National Trust. But they didn't want it. Then they offered it to, I think, the Missouri Historical Society, and they didn't want it. Then they offered it to the State Historical Society, and they didn't want it. And that's when the foundation stepped in and said, we'll take it. And it has been in the foundation's ownership since then. It was left, the house, the furnishings, and the grounds were left for as a memorial to her husband. Jules was kind of an amateur historian, and sometimes, as all of us amateur historians do, we get the facts wrong. He always said that Jules Valley was commandant, not Jules, but Francois Valley Sr. was commandant here. He was never commandant. He was captain of the militia, lieutenant particular, the juge. But we have a couple of tablets in the church that says he was commandant. And so he was always saying that the house was built in 1785. You know, the big flood of 1785, everybody moved the first day after that. Well, that didn't happen. It took 9 years before they moved 8 years before they moved the commandant and the soldiers, 9 years before they moved the church. So that house is not a 1785 house. We've proven that with the chronology. He also said that it was the home of Spanish soldiers. We got more houses that had Spanish soldiers. The J.B. Valley house, people claimed that was a fort, also claimed that it was home to Spanish soldiers. J.B. Valley provided housing to the soldiers, as did his father, but not there. Well, Ida Schaaf we've had some great independent researchers, we call them now, local historians, Lucille Bosler, and then before that, Ida Schaaf. And Ida Schaaf was a character. She was from St. Mary's, but she was dealing with the Missouri Historical Society quite a bit. And she writes this letter in 1931 questioning the age that Jules Valley is saying that house is 1785. She says, I am continually fighting the people of St. Genevieve in the matter of early history. Sound like Carl. This house, for instance, note some say it was constructed in 1784 and another to house Spanish soldiers. Going on, she said, another thing that I am in arm about is the American Legion claims the old cemetery and calls it the American Legion Cemetery. I have sassed the commander of the local post in this matter and have sent my puny little protest to the Post, the Chamber of Commerce, and to Father Van. The little snot of a commander, young enough to be my grandson, tells me the Post will not be dictated to in this matter. However, Father Van assures me it will not be, and it didn't. I love that little snot of a commander. I don't think she minced words. So we have a 1935 overhead view of St. Genevieve during our bicentennial. And you can see this is the Guibourd house right here. And it doesn't have the wall on it yet. It doesn't have the little cottage in the back. It doesn't have the magnolia tree that was so beautiful. It may have the beginnings of the linden tree. That is a beautiful tree in the backyard. So this is a great photograph, and it shows how many gardens were in St. Genevieve downtown during that time period. So as I mentioned, the foundation received ownership of this property, not without some problems, some litigation. There were two nieces from the St. James side of the family in East St. Louis. Because the will said that the foundation would get various stocks, and they protested it, it went to court, and the foundation won on that. And that was some of our earliest funding. But it opened in 1974. We celebrated the 200th anniversary of the house in 2006. So the Guibourd family tree down to the present is Jacques and Renee Louisinet, his son Edouard Francois, George, the nephew that had come over, cousin, I guess, to meet the people that were still living here. He had a son named Francois, who had a son named Jean. And Jean lived in Conde, the same house where Jacques Jean Renee was born. He died in 2015. But he had 5 kids, one who is known as Jacques Jean Renee Louisinet, his brother, sister Yolanda, brother Philippe, who I corresponded with, Francoise, and Bridget. Jacques Jean, when he got married, I think it was around 1991, he was going to come to America on his honeymoon, and somebody said, well, we have relatives there. So he came to St. Genevieve, and he visited the Jacques Guibourd house. And he actually spent a night of his honeymoon in the Jacques Guibourd house. So that was really, really cool. And I correspond with him occasionally. He said his father had some letters in the attic, but he's been busy working, and I'd really like to find out more about Jacques' early life and what happened when he went back to France and that sort of thing. So we have some unanswered questions that we're trying to work through. That Gabriel, I don't know where that came from in his name, but it's referenced places. Where's that inventory? I think of all of them, that's what I'd love to find. Where did his son Joseph die, and where's he buried in France? Why did the Searle not remarry? We'll probably never answer that. How do we prove that moral story of the barrel and coming over here and being free? That's something that we really got to do some more research on. And when and where did that one son, Augusta, die? We would really like to know that, the son of Eugene. So that's kind of the story of Jacques Guibourd. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, a couple of things before we go. First, thanks to everybody, and a special hand, please, for Bob for putting this on. Not only was the president presentation, but just putting it all together. Couple things. If you know anybody researching a subject, please call the Foundation for Restoration or call Bob, and we can take a look at putting them on our conference for 2024, which will be September 14th. Also, some of the upcoming events for the Foundation for Restoration. We have the October 28th, we're going to have our Deja Vu Spirit Reunion, Memorial Cemetery. I see a number of spirits here in the crowd. Of course, those of you who don't know, we portray people that are buried there. We tell their story. There's usually between 25, around 25 of us. And it's a great event. It's a lantern-led in the evening. So if you haven't been to one, try to maybe put it on your calendar and check it out. It's a very nice event. Again, that'll be October 28th. December 9th, we're having a new event. It'll be a holiday open house. We're going to have about 4 houses that are going to be decorated and having an open house at these houses to promote the Foundation for Restoration. December 10th, the next day, will be the Christmas Gala. Foundation for Restoration will be having their Christmas Gala, and that'll be in the evening on Sunday, December 10th. And we give out the awards for preservation, distinguished service, and a nice meal, again, December 10th. And then the first Saturday in February will be 2024 Queen's Ball, and that'll be at the VFW. Again, a great event. I was talking to Rule about that earlier. You know, it was his first one last year. Had a great time. He's planning on coming back, and we're looking forward to that. Queen's Ball being the first Saturday in February.